Welcome everyone to the Library Company's digital series, the Fireside Chat. I'm Deirdre Cooper Owens. I am the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company. And I am so excited to have Dr. Sarah Naramore present on Benjamin Rush, a historical figure, a founding father whose collection we house. But before I introduce Dr. Naramore, I'd like to tell you a bit about the Library Company for those who are viewing this series for the first time. It is the country's oldest cultural institution, founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin. And so the Library Company has a storied history. It served as the nation's first Library of Congress when the capital was in Philadelphia until 1800. And so by the 1950s, it becomes a research library, and that's how we function today. But a part of our programming that is so important to disseminating information to all segments of society is about bringing academic work to a broader audience, making it accessible, teaching people about our nation's past. And so I bring you greetings on behalf of Dr. Michael Bersanti, who is the director of the Library Company, our staff, and also our shareholders and trustees. Dr. Sarah E. Naramore is an assistant professor of history at Northwest Missouri State University. She completed her PhD in 2018 in the history of science at the University of Notre Dame and was an Albert M. Greenfield Dissertation Fellow at the Library Company in 2017. Her research focuses on the history of the American medical professions during the American Revolution and early Republic. Dr. Naramore has published on the work of Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush, his students, colleagues, and family in the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Science, Social History of Medicine, Endeavour, and Nursing Clio. Her recent book, and I have a copy here, you can see it is filled with Post-it notes, Benjamin Rush, Civic Health and Human Illness in the Early American Republic, just came out this month, published by the University of Rochester Press. And on a very selfish note, I'm asking you to go to the academic press so that you can purchase this book. I am a new editorial advisory member for the press. And so we're so excited to have Sarah present her work and in this program, where she has relied so much on the Library Company's archival documents. But this book explores the ways that Benjamin Rush and his students promoted medical theories they believed were best suited to the New Republic. I think you'll find some intersections with some of the conversations that we're having in the present moment as well around medicine and politics and resolutions for some of society's challenges. So without further ado, the next voice you will hear is Sarah Naramore. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Library Company for inviting me to give this talk. As Dr. Owens mentioned, and yes, I'm at that stage where the book is brand new and I'm carrying it around like a baby, showing it off to everybody with some Post-it notes. The book just came out and really, truly, as I hope will become evident during my presentation, could not have happened without Library Company support as this went from dissertation to book. So it's really an absolute thrill to be in this series and to be able to talk a little bit about Benjamin Rush and his role in sort of creating an idea of an American medical identity, biological identity in the early Republic. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and show my share my screen. So you don't have to just look at me. All right. Um, so yes, this is the plan tonight is to talk a little bit about the book for about 40 minutes. I want to introduce my work on Benjamin Rush. The arguments and structure of the text itself. So look at sort of what I'm talking about in each chapter. And then do a bit of a dive thinking about research. As will become evident, there is a lot out there about Benjamin Rush. He wrote an enormous amount, so figuring out what to look at and whose voices to include in this text were really important to me. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and especially those texts that were at the library company. So I want to spend some time towards the end of the talk really narrowing down on that. Before we do, however, I want to give a bit of a crash course on Rush himself and the world that he came from. For those who are maybe less familiar with the details of early American medical history or are coming at Rush from different angles. So who was Benjamin Rush? Why care about Benjamin Rush, sort of founding, gets the founding father label attached to him because he did sign the Declaration of Independence and was involved in a lot of political conversations. He was a physician, a working physician. Much of his day was actually spent going around prescribing medicines, consulting with people for their health. And he was also an educator. He worked at what would later become the University of Pennsylvania's medical school. So spent pretty much every late fall to early spring with students, working through for the first part of his career as professor of chemistry and later as professor of theory and practice of medicine, and really sort of laying the groundwork for what health was, what disease was, and critically what it meant to be a good doctor. Not just how to diagnose and cure, but how to set up a business, how to have a relationship with your patients. Which patients deserve more, for lack of better word, patience, right? As well. So a lot of this sort of social finagling. But for the very basics on Rush himself, he was born in Byberry, Pennsylvania in 1745, and died in Philadelphia in 1813. Byberry is just, is on the Delaware River north of Philadelphia. He moved into the city after his father's death when he was about 5 years old, a little 7 years old. He was a physician by training and faculty, again, at what would become the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, a prolific writer and thinker on many, many topics with many different people. And as noted in the last bullet point, he is everywhere in the revolutionary and early republic writing. You can't avoid him. If you pick up particularly in the secondary literature, it's very common, it feels like, to sort of pick up something like, when in doubt, you need an opinion on X historical event, Benjamin Rush probably has something to say about it. And he probably said it loudly, or at least in writing, to John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. And that's often how Rush comes to us. We see Rush often in the image that we have on this slide. So this was painted by Thomas Sully the year Rush died. So this is a portrait from 1813, with the elder statesman Rush established within his professional networks, within his political networks, having taught, by my estimates, coming up on about 3,000 students who sat in those lecture halls based on his ledgers at the library company, and settled, right? Sort of one of those almost dusty figures where we pull their tomes off the shelf and figure that there is some sort of founding father wisdom coming from them. Now, astute observers will note that this is not the image of Rush that I picked for the cover of my book. And if you are curious why, we can get into the details about that in Q&A. But one reason that the book version of Rush is a much younger version, and one that's not settled yet. And that's how I like us to see him, as someone who was a living person who changed over time, who was shaped and changed by the events around him. Some of you may already have an image of Rush yourself in your head as this figure who appears again and again in early history. The Philadelphia physician who had opinions and thoughts on everything from yellow fever to sanitation to at what age you should get married, to the sometimes referred to as the father of American psychiatry. So these very clear, strong connections to medical history, including heavy bleeding, or physical treatment for mental illness. On the more in social and political history, we can see Rush and his ideas about government, ideas about education, social reform, prison reform, pops up in modern scholarship. And this leads to a history that is fragmented, where we have a Rush that is often a side character in the historiography, but doesn't coalesce especially well all the time. Or in the instances where we do get a Rush, or we have sort of all of Rush's pieces beginning to be put together, it's often self-consciously in a biography, which is not exactly what I wanted to do here. So again, biography focusing in on the person, the world as seen by Benjamin Rush. I'm hoping to look a little bit about how Benjamin Rush was seen by his world. We can come back to this if need be. This is in part from my own mindset of the Rush family. As part of seeing Rush as his world, I do want to think about who else was in his immediate space, and that includes his wife, Julia Stockton Rush, as an important figure, his mother, Susanna Hall Rush, who's responsible for a lot of his early education and shaping, and then the fact that we have here the 9 Rush children who survived to adulthood. For space, I did leave out the 4 who died in infancy, but particularly we're thinking about Rush as someone interested in the new republic, interested in the next generation, especially as we can sort of to the penultimate, or to the penultimate and ultimate chapters in my book. He's really looking to the next generation and talking a lot about education. He's not doing this in a vacuum. He is the father of a large family. Similarly, when he makes particular choices to focus on what is financially profitable for him, he often specifically notes the fact that he is a husband and father of many children and needs to make money. Also briefly, a little bit about 18th century medicine that's going to be important as well when we think about Benjamin Rush. This is both in and outside the context of the United States. He comes at the end of what historians sometimes refer to as the age of systems. This is a period where, to really make your mark, make a name for yourself as a doctor, You often do so by having a full explanation of how health and disease work. So thinking about disease more as the malfunction in a body and less as something that's external to it. We've really flipped in the modern world. Not that we think all diseases are something external, but our sort of default paradigm is so often infectious disease. Like the disease is that thing that comes into your body and makes you sick. Often even going so far as to really kind of blend pathogen and disease, right? That's not the case in the 18th century yet. So a lot of the focus is on physiology in relationship to health. So how do bodies work? How do they break? And then how do you put them back into functioning order? So having an overarching system of understanding, of putting together, like this is how healthy bodies function. This is specifically how they malfunction. This is how you put them back together. Makes a lot of sense in this mindset. He's kind of at the end of this tradition. So we're going to see that when he actually talks about having an American system of medicine for American citizens, because their bodies are shaped by very different circumstances. This is the tradition he's coming from. We'll also see in this period the influence, and for Rush, the ultimate rejection of Linnaean classification for diseases. So trying to figure out particular diseases, name them, often with sort of binomial nomenclature, sometimes with binomial nomenclature, and then connect disease to treatment, which might sound a little bit more familiar to a modern audience. Rush ends up mostly rejecting this. This is called nosology. He thinks it's overly complicated, not very useful, and probably not true. We also have new ideas and theories driven by colonial, and in the case of the United States, post-colonial and also imperial, depending on your perspective in the United States, experiences. So the idea of differences in local conditions, starting to have a bigger influence on medicine, and then also chemistry. As we sort of shift, particularly we have the 18th century affinities-based chemistry, and then heading a little bit more as the chemical revolution kicks off later in the 18th century. This is what he's sort of coming from. Now, most people practicing medicine in the United States or anywhere, frankly, are not these sort of like very theoretical learned professionals. Most people, most of this sort of trickles down a little bit in some ways, in some sort of pop culture sensibility. Okay, more questions. Then very quickly, little bit briefly, thinking about Philadelphia, just as a reminder, Philadelphia is truly the greatest city in sort of revolutionary era America. Sorry, Lin-Manuel Miranda, it is not New York. I say this as a New Yorker, but it's not New York. So Philadelphia is the largest city in the colonies, and then the early republic in Rush's lifetime. It's a growing commercial center. It hosts early scientific and cultural institutions, including the Library Company, including the American Philosophical Society, not too much of a walk away. For the United States, it has connections to the greater British Atlantic world, but also interestingly, in part because of its tolerant Quaker background, we have a large number of people who are of non-conforming religious denominations. For medicine, this is going to be really interesting and important because it means that our Philadelphians who might be Quakers, or in the case of Benjamin Rush, Presbyterian, if they're going to go for formal medical training in Britain, are not going to go to England, where you still need to be Anglican. You're going to go to Scotland, which happens to be much better anyway, because the Scottish medical schools are better. or at least more forward thinking. So when Rush goes to the University of Edinburgh in 1768, he is going to probably the most sort of cutting edge medical school available to him. Okay, so that's Rush, that's the background. We know that he's involved in a lot of things, or at least I've hinted at that. You may have heard of him before. You might have a vague idea that the guy signed the Declaration of Independence and bled too many people. Those are usually the first sort of Rush thoughts. But why did I care about Rush? A lot of people have written about Rush over the past 2 centuries, and much of that is very good writing. So what did I have to contribute? That's something I think that's always daunting for a historian. Like, what, being interested in a topic is one thing, but really saying, what does my voice have to bring? What does my analysis, what does my research have to bring to this that hasn't been said already? And not just for the selfish, I'd like to publish something, so what hasn't been said already, but what is the conversation here? So I'm broadly interested in the way health, illness, and the way we think about the way health and illness and the way we think about human bodies expand, influences the way our society works. So Rush is, and if not the ideal person to consider these relationships in the early American Republic, because he's so well recorded, but also because he's well recorded, he's reflective, and I think we also have good reason to believe he was important, not just because we've kept his papers and he had some famous friends, so they kept his papers, but because he did have a very self-conscious outreach, that he consciously published pamphlets and in magazines. There's very little Benjamin Rush in medical journals, and at one point he mentions this, that he wants ordinary people to be reading this. This is sort of a one-man public health campaign sometimes, whether it's a strictly medical work or not, tends to be in things like the Columbian Magazine or in a standalone pamphlet or in something of his own, or throwing something into a newspaper. Very, very rarely in publications just for medical men. And the other part is because of his work as an educator. He stood in lecture halls that ranged in size from the beginning of his career to quite small, like about a dozen people, to by the end of his career, maybe 300 men in a room. Some of whom were there for the same class multiple times, because that's what you did. Many of whom sort of hung their hat on the fact that they had been students of Benjamin Rush. Some, as a colleague of mine has brought up, some people in the 19th century lied about being students of Benjamin Rush. And the fact that he's somebody you'd want to lie and say that you took classes with when you didn't, to like boost your own credentials, is a pretty good indication of things. And the other is the nature of the correspondence that came to him. So who wrote to him, what they asked, both the sort of intellectually powerful and medically important people from across the United States and even the world. This includes European correspondence. Rush his Latin was not very good. His French was pretty decent. He could muddle through reading a couple other languages, but he could keep up a decent correspondence in either English or French written correspondence, and he did. But also just ordinary people writing in for medical advice, asking for help, sharing their random ideas about social betterment and thinking that, well, Benjamin Rush might think this is a good idea. And in some cases, having that reflecting back on Rush's own self-fashioning, sort of saying like, well, if there's a case of one man who wrote from New Jersey after the yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, saying that he saw something similar out in rural New Jersey. And he starts it off saying, I never would have thought to write to you, except basically how he presented himself in the papers. Like you stayed in the city, you treated patients, and wrote in the newspapers. And because of that public persona, basically I felt comfortable writing in. So with Benjamin Rush, that's that self-fashioning. So he ends up being this interesting, really fascinating lens to look at these questions. Someone who's both interested in the intersections of all these different ideas that I'm interested in, but was recognized as that kind of person during his lifetime. So essentially the argument, if I'm allowed to quote myself, in the years during and following the American Revolution, Rush's ideas and actions formed a unified program for national improvement that should be understood as independent from the professionalization and specialization that was to come in the 19th century. He shifted a generation of medical minds to think of citizens of the United States as Americans in need of a biological as well as political identity. Americans in this sense suffered from certain kinds of diseases, ate certain kinds of food, lived with unique mental stresses, and improved their situation through the action of public institutions. Rush's American system of medicine promoted the primacy of local knowledge, rejected specific diseases, and emphasized connections between body, mind, and the natural, social, and political environment. So that's kind of the core of what I think he was up to. So from this perspective, Rush's myriad interests and ideas start to form something like a unified whole, like a program, rather than someone with lots of random hobbies. He needed to understand the challenges of the new nation, and at the same time wanted to direct the health of his fellow citizens to support the republic. So I think Rush wanted to do what he believed was good for the country. That didn't always lead to things that we would unambiguously refer to as good now. But I think he was striving for something, for some sort of betterment. So again, this returns us to this idea of bodies, minds, and environments as deeply connected, this physiological whole. There's a hint here about the 18th century idea that republics in particular are fragile, that without constantly working on keeping the republic healthy, or keeping a republic healthy, keeping citizens virtuous, that you could have that republic fall apart. Plays into this. This is how Rush wants to secure the future. And the result, again, is this American system. All right. So if I can briefly sort of just break down the chapters, and then we'll have some fun with letters before we go to Q&A. So again, getting into this with Rush has been absolutely fascinating. It's involved an enormous amount of material, spread over different historiographies and different topics, and which leads you to sort of challenge how to put it together. So broadly, I've got 2 parts over 8 chapters. Where part 1 is is titled "Making an American System." So how do we end up with a Benjamin Rush in the first place, right? What can he draw from realistically as well? So it's putting the pieces together so you can have his American system, and then part 2 looks at how he uses it. So how he spreads his ideas, how he acts in his practice, and what he hopes for the future. So the first chapter is largely biographical. It's about and focused on his education. Before I go on, I will point out, I'm going to sort of go through here. And again, there's a lot of rush. Please, if I say something and you are curious about it, I promise there is a longer answer and deep dive to it. So please jot it down, have it ready for the Q&A. And for whatever you think would be are interested in delving into, please just ask. There's a lot here. So again, so chapter 1 basically is education, the West Nottingham Academy of Maryland, followed by the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, a medical apprenticeship in Philadelphia under John Redman, and then his doctorate at the medical degree at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, under the influence in theory and practice and in physiology and science, really from William Cullen, but also importantly John Gregory, who's medical faculty as well, but really I think had a lot of influence on his moral and philosophical writing, and Rush's moral and philosophical character as well. And in general, the sort of there are some echoes of sort of Scottish 18th century ideas about the importance of doing social good with science and medicine that we see trickling into and really expanding in the American context, and Rush is a good example of it. Chapter 2 looks at Rush as an American physician. So what happens when he comes home in 1770 and very quickly has to actually make a living. His mother worked very, very hard as a widow and businesswoman to get her son a very good education, but afterwards it's kind of like, now you have to take care of us because the piggy bank is empty. So Rush is working really hard, but also trying to establish himself in the intellectual circles in Philadelphia, which actually gets us to Rush's system and worldview with 3 main points. Bodies worked or malfunctioned based on the state of their environment. All organs had distinctive roles to play in the maintenance of a healthy body. So a republic rather than a monarchy. So he'd later call William Cullen's nervous-based physiology to monarchical. And Rush wanted to emphasize the interactions between blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels in particular, but this idea that multiple organ systems are functioning in tandem rather than one controlling everything, which is a really interesting sort of political lay on bodies or take on the body politic. And then 3, that the American environment was unique, especially after the revolution, and creating a republic where people are stimulated and thinking and needing to can make political and social decisions in a way that you don't as a colony, and that they therefore provided unique challenges to human bodies. Making and sharing medical knowledge looks at correspondence networks, journals, and professional organizations. Excuse me. And some of his connections with other scientists and other thinkers. In chapter 4, learning from bodies, really thinking about the clinic and lecture hall as sites of information gathering, as well as sex and gender in Rush's medicine. Very, very briefly, sex is really the only fundamental at birth unchangeable physical reality that Rush talks about. So for Rush, male and female are very firm, strict categories, and sex difference is more than just the genitals. That the difference between male and female bodies could be seen in multiple different areas, and then that this then reflected how it reflected how ideal gender expression. So idealized roles of men and women in society that map onto these very strict ideas about sex. On the contrary, like many 18th century people, Rush is still in a world of a more fluid racial theory, that race is something that is created maybe in part by heredity, but largely from environment or social conditions. And he does this a lot in this chapter. I look more at his ideas about Native American bodies. Chapter 5, I look a little bit more about how he thinks about Black bodies. So part 2, again, very quickly, explaining variations. So you go from like sort of learning from bodies to trying to explain variation and change variation. So how to create the ideal Republican woman. The instability of race as a category in the United States, which leads to Rush both being opposed to slavery, but also claiming that Blackness might be a disease that could be cured and eventually everyone would be white. So this is assimilationist racism at like its most extreme level. Like everyone will become white as if we like end slavery and everyone is like civilized. Please, everyone, note my air quotes when I'm using them. And then also, so looking at those ideas, confronting climatic ills. This is where I talk about yellow fever, as well as goiter a little bit. Care, curing, and prevention in American institutions. So chapters 7 and 8 really dig into like proactive ways of shaping the present and future. So chapter 7 with institutions, looking at the hospital dispensary practice and diseases of the mind, public health initiatives, and then finally wrapping up with something that I think was probably very important to Rush, education. So preparing what he saw as the next generation of Republican machines, which is this amazing image of like these of children being these little like automatons that if you educate them properly in school, at home, that they will automatically be little Republicans, little small R Republicans, that they don't have to go through the difficult and to Rush sometimes physically and mentally dangerous transition of going from subject to citizen. They're starting out as citizens, so they can be like automatically created to replicate the Republic. And I think that's where we sort of see this most enmeshed version of Rush as the physician interested in bodies and minds and disease and health, mixed with his social concerns, is how to deal with children and how to deal with education. All right, I think I have just a few minutes before we pass it over to Q&A. But I did, again, want to emphasize the importance of correspondence, because it's one thing to sort of look at Benjamin Rush and see, oh, he's a guy who wrote a lot and had a lot of ideas. He's putting these things together, but it is hard to figure out, what's important and how, and did this matter? So much of this owes back to a conversation with James Green back in 2017 when I was getting ready for the dissertation fellowship. James Green at the library company. And we were talking about looking at Rush, and he's like, people don't really look at the letters very much because he didn't write them, or that's how I remember the conversation. Because they're not Rush's letters, they're letters to Rush. He's like, I think you might want to look at them. So I looked at 3,500 of them, and that is still not all of them. And it absolutely shaped the way I think about Rush, and the way I really think about how we can do history this way. We have this benefit of seeing how others thought about Rush, not just what Rush put out there. As well as getting an amazing sort of snapshot of American society at this point. Not that everybody would write to Rush, but a surprisingly broad number of people would. There are patients, there are hundreds of students and colleagues who are not especially famous themselves, their papers are not preserved, but several of their letters might be because they ended up in this Rush collection. Patients or people who are on the edge of the new American empire in St. Louis or Louisville, Kentucky, or New Orleans, who are far away from familiarity and are writing back to Rush. And he's getting not only the $10 for consultation by post, but he's getting a view of a place that he would never go to further think about the diversity, and particularly in terms of climate and environment of the United States, which then reinforced his idea that his students needed to be prepared to deal with the unexpected. So to have a system of medicine that was adaptable to different spaces. So it was really fantastic. And this is just a snapshot of like how I tried to organize it. So it means you need to think about the sender and the recipient. Again, I looked at about 3,500 letters. That is only a fraction of the existing Rush correspondence, and a fraction and much more likely didn't survive. It ended up at the library company because Rush's son James donated his library on his death and his papers, and therefore his father's stuff too. Rush did not keep copies of his own letters, but he did sometimes write notes on the back, which is helpful, usually prescription notes, essentially. And I was able to focus on the day-to-day rather than those from just elite individuals. So I did consciously use the numbered and like alphabetical folders and boxes rather than like the correspondence of more prominent figures which have been pulled out and are in different folders. So like chemist Joseph Priestley's letters are separate from the P's, but I looked at just like the volume with the letter P. That makes sense. So just to finish up quickly, some surprising things when we looked about the data this way. So sometimes you get things that are, again, surprising. It helps you think about how you do medicine, telehealth in the early 19th century. And you send letters, you send money, and you can get responses. I was surprised by how much of it was letters of introduction, about 12%, often from colleagues, later on former students who are recommending new students who are coming to the university. So we see this, professional genealogy growing. Things that are less surprising, but still very interesting. Discussions about yellow fever are common. Social concerns are very common. People pitch random ideas to him. And others are often sort of thank yous. There are letters from former students that sort of on their first job, thanking Rush for his example. Sometimes, unsurprisingly for me, when I first went into it, they talk about his medical system, or like, oh, we're doing X therapeutic practice, usually bloodletting, which is working well. But just as often, it was social. Thank you for encouraging me to treat the poor, or to pay attention to what the women in the household are saying, or how to have a professional conversation with fellow physicians, the importance of going to church. That all ends up in these letters too, this sort of interesting reach back to a professor. And then sometimes I type details as well. So that's about 40 minutes. I think from when I started, I'm happy to shift it over to Q&A, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I see we do have a couple of questions in our Q&A function. And also, I think I saw some in the chat as well. And so since I'm I'm the moderator. I'm going to ask a question. Please don't take too long because I want to get to the others. But as I was reading your book, Rush was really invested in showing the difference between America and Britain, right? And even looking at the environment, the landscape, the kind of physiological model of America as distinct. And it made me think of John Winthrop's, A City on the Hill, this kind of notion of exceptionalism. And I just wanted to know, your thoughts on that for those who haven't read your book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just to do it quickly so we have time. I think that's a great sort of comparison. He firmly believed in this exceptionalism and that it was only getting stronger, that there's already this physical difference that North America, that they've been talked about for 2 centuries at this point, right? That North America had more extreme seasons than England, that it was wetter, debates about, were the animals degenerate, right? Which of course he, like his friend Thomas Jefferson, would firmly say, no, we're fine. But then Rush goes on, because of this connection between bodies and minds, this means this goes for sort of your mental space as well. So after the revolution, this exceptionalism only increases. So we've got the physical difference to contend with, but now we're mentally different, and that's going to sort of solidify this American difference, and really seeing white Americans as a specific, unique group, right? And an idealized group from his perspective as well, and that other groups, that other people living in North America then needed to aspire to become, whether they were indigenous or of African descent.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to the attendee who asked the first question, John Jackson. Would you talk about the role of bloodletting in Rush's approach to the treatment of disease? And then I'm going to just tack on another, because you've got a number of questions kind of coming up.
Yeah.
So that first about bloodletting in Rush, and the second that I see is from Alan Lipman. So Dr. Lipman says, Sarah, while I don't intend to denigrate Rush's many positive contributions to medicine and to society, other sources have criticized his arrogance in not recognizing that some of his therapeutic modalities were actually harmful. So for example, bleeding, purging. In your studies, did you find any reason or reasons to support their criticism?
Those are both great questions. I can take them together as well. I think so. Briefly, so the bloodletting and the purging kind of goes with this. So Rush believed that when you were sick, the problem was that there's this entity called excitement in your body. I'm sorry I didn't get into this as you leave, but that basically you have this kind of energy for which sort of that needs to move through your body, and your organ systems, especially those that go through the body, your blood, the nervous system, the lymph, are responsible for that balance and circulation. But if it gets held up somewhere or it's not flowing, that gives you disease. So the bloodletting and the purging, so either and purging is basically designed. I kind of think about it as like if your computer's giving you trouble, you unplug it and then you plug it back in and try to turn it on again. That's kind of what he's doing with your body. So he did purge and bleed more than his contemporaries, like larger quantities of blood, in part because he thought fevers, and this was a common belief, that fevers were more extreme in the United States than in Europe. So you have a more extreme disease, you need a more extreme treatment. And the other is to bring the body down as low as possible without killing you, and then bring you back up to health slowly. So the criticisms of Rush's treatments, yeah, absolutely, we should not do any of this. Even his former students, when you read things that they wrote in the later 19th century, like in the 1840s and 50s, they'll say Rush, like, great guy, like great on like the moral aspects of being a physician. Don't do what he did. It will be very bad. So that's sort of the logic. But he's doing it also with this idea, again, don't do it, never do it. But this idea of sort of bringing you down very low and then really focusing on a slow and long convalescence, which until the 20th century really is not something that you probably need to qualify. Like you just assume like you're sick, you're going to spend the next month getting better. But I think we forget about that a little bit. That was my biggest complaint about how individual people handled COVID as I watched them. Like, you just had COVID, take a couple weeks. Yeah, so the criticism about, from what we know now, justified, probably should have known then in some cases, but I think people were also just really, more people were especially in something like yellow fever, which was fairly new and very scary. We're still with really scary diseases. If someone trusts you and has a good reason, you think, to do something that seems scary and harsh, it seems better than the alternative, so you might go along with it. The example I sometimes use with students with bloodletting is like, although this works and you should do it, right? Like, chemotherapy sucks. But it's the idea that it's going to take care of the cancer. It's kind of what he's doing.
Thank you.
If that helps. But yeah, no, just we should not let out like half of a person's blood, for sure.
Thank you. So I am going to also direct people to our webinar chat. Please let me know if I am pronouncing your name correctly or incorrectly, even with a thumbs up. Stephen Fried or Freed, I'm sure you know Sarah, says, for anyone inspired, he has a hyperlink to read Rush's writings. They're available through a portal, the Benjamin Rush portal, and he has the link provided for us. There's also a question from one of the interns at the library company, Kaylin Gray, who says, I'm doing research on Rush at LCP, and this is an undergrad intern. She noticed how often he references the capital S system. And so Kaylin's wondering if you saw the idea of the system as something aligned with humoral therapy or theories, or if he was trying to create a distinct new theory separate from the humors. And then I'm going to try to get in, because I know we're kind of,
sorry.
No, this is great. You got lots of questions. And then Fern has another kind of question around what Rush is doing. So Kaylin's is about that capital S. Is he trying to do something different than the classic humoral theory? And then Susan Kern wants to know, how does Rush define American, right? How long do Europeans or Africans need to be on the continent to fit the characteristics Rush observed as American? How did his ideas about Americans address ideas some Europeans still had, that people and animals exist in diminished state when they spend time in North America?
So Rain knows this. Yes, the Benjamin Rush portal is great. I believe I mentioned it in the introduction to you, Stephen, so it's fantastic. Also, Stephen wrote a great biography about Rush as well. If you want like a really lovely detailed bio on Benjamin Rush as well. Kaylin, he is doing something that is not humoral theory. So he's trying to do his own distinct system. Like I said, that's mostly about this idea of excitement moving through the body. So it's not the four humors. It's pretty far. We're about a step and a half, 2 steps away from humoral at this point. So he's trying to distinguish himself largely from his professor in Scotland, William Cullen, and Cullen's system of physiology and of medicine, and his contemporary John Brown, not John Brown of like leading Kansas John Brown, a different John Brown, who was a Scottish physician. So there are multiple systems in the late 18th century that are not humoral systems that are competing about physiology. And then finally, about Americans. That's a great question. So for someone who's like race is fluid and all of that, right? Like the bar to fully Americanness is different based on race. So it seems like the timeline is very short for Europeans. Like you can kind of just become American. Doesn't really seem to think about like how long that takes. He is thinking with Blackness, with people of African descent, that this is a longer generations long process. He was fascinated by the case of this one man, Henry Moss, in Philadelphia, who had what we've now called vitiligo. So he was losing pigmentation in parts of his skin. But Rush saw that as like an expedited version of what he thought might happen, that Moss was a free man and he looked like he was whitening. But he assumed this would take a long time. He is not worried about degeneration. He thinks the United States is fine, that we just need to be better about cleaning our streets in Philadelphia to prevent fevers, and that actually that the climate was very healthy, or could be, but that urban areas were bad, which for a city boy I find hilarious. He never lived anywhere long-term besides like Philadelphia or its near environs, but he worried about cities.
Thank you. And I am going to ask, I'm assuming you might know this person, Susan Naramore.
That's my aunt.
Okay. This will be the last question. You might have seen me. I took pictures. Yeah. Because you have so many pictures. So for those who have open questions, I will send them to Dr. Naramore, and hopefully she can answer them. She has an active Twitter account, so you can also check there.
Oh yeah, please do.
Susan Naramore says, I was wondering if you could speak more on concepts of women and their role in creating ideal citizens in a new republic. In the American case, especially how you presented Rush, education and the 19th century term domestic sphere are the places for women to fill a role in the republic. This struck Aunt Susan as interesting versus the way French women in citizenship is articulated as connected to symbolic roles and through the economy. What about the American Republic made education and women's roles in children's education as a central pillar of citizenships? I think that's a good note to end on as well. So how would you like to answer that question?
It is. I will say Aunt Susan is also a Dr. Naramore Mar. So
Dr. Aunt Susan.
You can't tell by the question. Yeah, so when we're talking about Rush's ideas about women, we're drawing from what's been termed, we're less about that sort of 19th century sort of domestic sphere or cult of domesticity. That's a little bit more sort of in the 1820s, 1830s, but what's been termed sort of Republican motherhood or Republican womanhood. So this idea that women have this important role in the context of their family and social circles to bring forward Republican values and ideas, and particularly ideas of virtue. So there is this idea, and Rush has this, that women have like a more, and this literally goes back to how he thinks like our brains are shaped, a more acute sense of the deity, a more robust sort of moral core. So this goes to women as this idea of women as the first educators of their children, particularly, I mean, education in terms of like very basic primary school education, but also just, things like sharing and not torturing animals and being good to your siblings. Early religious education, that kind of thing. So that's part of it. Women as sort of knowledgeable companions to the men in their lives as well, both in terms of partnership. I didn't get a chance to talk very much about Julia in this talk, but Julia Rush is a fascinating person as well, and comes up as this idealized version. So there are letters between them when they're separate where they'll be talking about the kids, but then Rush will be like, I really want you to read this new philosophy by William Paley so we can talk about it and how we can adapt it to better raise our children. They were real fun. But this idea of like having that companionship. So not that you're going to like go out and to, be a productive member of the economy or like vote or something, but that you're part of these circles, that you're reminding those in your lives, your children, your husband, your fathers, your brothers, but also your friends, about how, about these important values. Because somebody like Rush also is in a lot of these heterosocial spaces, but like he had women friends, just platonic friendships, and that was not especially uncommon in this period. We get a little bit more sort of social gender separation in the next generation, but this revolutionary generation, these salons in Philadelphia, it's men and women. There's this great letter where Julia Rush was visiting family in Princeton. Benjamin was in Philadelphia. Benjamin gets a letter from the president of Princeton, Samuel Stanhope Smith at that point, who was a friend, saying like, thanks for letting her stay on, for a few extra weeks. Our society is all the better for her conversation in Princeton. So that kind of role as well.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for your engagement, for this informative talk. Once again, if you look in the link, you can purchase Dr. Naramore's book, or you can from the link provided, or you can also go to the University of Rochester Press to publish this newest volume on Benjamin Rush. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. You're getting accolades in the program. All right, thank you. And we invite you to our next Fireside Chat.